including one in Russian, which I can't read, but it's very cool. Okay, so, as I said, this is very short. I'm going to read you the very first line of the very first chapter of the very first book of the Inheritance Cycle. Here goes. Wind howled through the night, carrying a scent that would change the world. Thank you. By the way, if you need me to speak louder, stick up your hands, because my ears are partially plugged, so it's hard for me to tell. All right, who's got a copy of Eldest? Oh, you're cheating! I'll just take the second one. All right. Now, one of the things I did, of course, in writing the books is I created a couple of languages for the world, which was lots of fun. The main one is the ancient language, the elf language. And I based it partially on Old Norse, which I think gave it a good sound and feel. So I'm going to read you an elvish blessing in the ancient language, but I have to apologize because I have an absolutely horrendous elvish accent. And that's partly because I'm not an elf, unfortunately, but also because in the ancient language, you were supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you would in Spanish or Italian. And I can't do that. In fact, the only way I can roll my R's, and I apologize because I know this sounds absolutely obscene, but the only way I can roll my R's is by wiggling my uvula. That's the thing in the back of your throat. So, I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you guys, and I hope you like it too. Atra sterni onovelduen, maran lifa unijarta onder, undu everina onovarda. Now that said, the dwarf language is actually my favorite because I invented it from scratch, because it's just a really meaty language. You can just sink your teeth into it. In fact, I've always said that if I could go into Aragon's world, if I could go into Alagasia, I'd want to be a dwarf, because they live a really long time, and they have a lot more fun than the elves. And so I'd be a dwarf, and I'd write dwarvish opera. In fact, I may still write some dwarvish opera. Every time I mention it, though, my agent turns white as a sheet. But we'll see. Okay, so here's a chunk of Dwarvish, and unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent Dwarvish accent. And that's because in Dwarvish, you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So, let the wiggling commence. Form Rethkarach! Form Jürgen Carmiter! Nos eta Goroth Bastardag! Der Incesti Rankithen! Jak isword as Berzeligor, door Dorgrengst as Schwelden Rak Anuin, Mog Torak, Jürgen friend. All right, thank you. As you might imagine, dwarves are always usually very hoarse, and no one much likes listening to their love poems. Except maybe the Scottish. Okay, so, Book 3. As you might notice, Book 3 is a rather large book. And like most large books, it has a lot of sentences in it. And, you know, there's some sentences I'm a little bit more fond of compared with others. There's one, for example, that involves a bomb-bleeding bumblebee, which I probably should have cut from the book, but I just liked it too much, and so I left it. But in any case, among all the many sentences that make up this very large book, there's one in particular that is my absolute favorite. And I want to read it to you. And I think it's just a particularly well-written sentence. I think it has a lot of literary merit, and hopefully you'll agree with me. So, are you ready to hear my absolutely favorite sentence from Brissinger? Yeah? Die, puny human! I mean, really, what's the point of writing fantasy if you can't write lines like, die, puny human? Bow ties are cool. Thank you, thank you. Yes, I am a Doctor Who fan. And in fact, some of you may have noticed I slipped some mentions of the Good Doctor into both the third and fourth books in the Inheritance cycle. In fact, I just got to, as I mentioned, shake Sylvester McCoy's hand, and I was at the Supernova convention in Australia, and I actually got to meet Eric Roberts, who, as some of you may know, played the Master in the television movie, so it was actually kind of creepy to be standing next to the Master. Creepy and cool. Okay, so, this is going to be, one second. This is going to be just a slightly longer reading. Now, for those of you who have not read the fourth book, don't worry, no spoilers. But I'm going to read to you from the very end of the very first chapter of the very last book of the Inheritance cycle. I hope you enjoy it. The sound was stabbing, slicing, shivering, like metal scraping against stone. Aragon's teeth vibrated in sympathy, and he covered his ears with his hands, grimacing as he twisted around, trying to locate the source of the noise. Saphira tossed her head, and even through the din, he heard her whine in distress. Aragon swept his gaze over the courtyard 2 separate times before he noticed a faint puff of dust rising up the wall of the keep from a foot-wide crack that had appeared beneath the blackened, partially destroyed window where Bloodgarm had killed the magician. As the squeal increased in intensity, Aragon risked lifting one of his hands off his ear to point at the crack. "Look!" he shouted to Arya, who nodded in acknowledgement. He replaced his hand over his ear. Without warning or preamble, the sound stopped. Aragon waited for a moment, then slowly lowered his hands, for once wishing that his hearing was not quite so sensitive. Just as he did, the crack jerked open wider, spreading until it was several feet across, and raced down the wall of the keep. Like a bolt of lightning, the crack struck and shattered the keystone above the doors to the building, showering the floor below with pebbles. The whole castle groaned, and from the damaged window to the broken keystone, the front of the keep began to lean outward. "Run!" Aragon shouted to the Varden, though the men were already scattering to either side of the courtyard, desperate to get out from under the precarious wall. Aragon took a single step forward, every muscle in his body tense, as he searched for a glimpse of Roran somewhere in the throng of warriors. At last, Aragon spotted him, trapped behind the last group of men by the doorway, bellowing madly at them, his words lost in the commotion. Then the wall shifted and dropped several inches, leaning even further away from the rest of the building, pelting Roran with rocks, knocking him off balance, and forcing him to stumble backward under the overhang of the doorway. As Roran straightened from a crouch, his eyes met Aragon's, and in his gaze, Aragon saw a flash of fear, helplessness, quickly followed by resignation, as if Roran knew that no matter how fast he ran, he could not possibly reach safety in time. A wry smile touched Roran's lips, and the wall fell. Thank you. Thank you, thank you. Does he live? Does he die? Read chapter 2. I would love to try to answer as many of your questions as we have time for now. However, I would ask you to keep in mind that if you have read book 4 or 3 or 2 or 1, there are probably some people here who haven't, so let's